And hello and welcome to everybody. This is the 7th in the series now, Considerations and Strategies for Running Clinical Trials During the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Shani Dyer and I'm the CEO of ARCS Australia. So the session today, we'll hear from Ian Adams from GSK Consumer Healthcare, from Melissa Hagan, who's the Director of Queensland Clinical Trials Coordination Unit, Anita Vandermeer, who's the Manager of Clinical Trials New South Wales, Office of Health for Medical Research, Susan Hesthorpe, who's the Manager Coordinating Office for Clinical Trials in Victoria, and finally Angela Masterton, who's Director Clinical Management at PPD, an international CRO based in Australia. So our panel today will speak to you about the world over the horizon. What will the world look like and how can we shape it with the things we do now in relation to COVID-19? We must plan, we must do all the things necessary to ensure we come out of this bigger and stronger. As you know, the important messages that we've been sending about Australia is that we're open for business, and this is reflected in the CTPRG and state position statements. But importantly, we're looking to ensure that as we are maintaining clinical trials going in Australia during this time, the changes that we've seen, we're looking to ensure that we embed those changes into policies and standards. It's really pleasing to see how the sectors pull together across government and industry, really working well together to embed the change. And this is the sort of thing we're going to be hearing about today. So if we go to the next slide, Joe. Again, I'd like to thank our series sponsors, MTP Connect and New South Wales Health, who've come on board to sponsor the series. That's really, really helpful for us. Next slide. As everybody knows who've been listening to these series, we've been running a volunteer program that brings expertise to sites who have otherwise been affected by COVID-19 and staff being lost to the COVID-19 front line. There was a great article at the Industry Health Hub last week about the program successes, and please go on and have a look at that. The volunteer program is sponsored by the Queensland government and the New South Wales government, and we thank them very much for that assistance because every little bit helps, and I think the sites that we're helping are very much appreciative of that as well. So if we go to the next slide, again, just remind everybody about the housekeeping, keeping yourselves muted. That will be happening by us. Please don't record the session. We will be recording and we will make it available to everybody on our website. So that will be then available because some people can't make it this time. And again, we will put questions at the end. So either put them in the chat as you hear them and we'll get to them towards the end. Next slide, Joe. So this series is an important update for those working in the clinical trial sector. But as we've said, please ensure that the information that you obtain is from health.gov.au for your real life updates and as well your various state departments to get those individual updates. Next slide. So I can't believe we're at number 7 in the series. It's scary that the time has gone through, and while some of the lockdowns have been being lifted slowly, we know that given that we've got winter coming, it sounds like Great Game of Thrones, but winter is coming, and that's going to make it difficult for us as the lockdown eases and we get more people out and about. So, but let's be hearing today about what recovery looks like in this session. Next slide, Joe. For those of you who don't know, ARCS is an organisation who is here for you as individuals working in the clinical research and regulatory sector. We're your voice. We're helping you with your professional development and your career pathways. We've been around for a heck of a long time, and I hope serving a good function for you now. We are a member-based organisation, so if you like the sorts of things that we've been doing, go onto our website and join. We would love you to be a member of ARCS and join our professional group. That'd be great. Okay, so that takes us to all the things I really wanted to say. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we've got our speakers organised, and I will ask our first speaker to speak to us today. Our first speaker is Ian Adams. Ian's been leading some of the COVID thinking for GSK, as well as leading the GSK Pfizer Consumer Healthcare Joint Venture. And he's been with GSK for over 20 years. For all of you guys today, I'm just going to say 20 years plus because, you know, it gets a bit scary otherwise. But Ian will give us some of his insights from the work that's been happening at GSK. Thank you, Ian.
So look, Shani, pleasure to be able to talk to all of our colleagues from ARCS today and beyond ARCS if they're on the line. And really quite a unique time to have the chance to talk about, you know, coming out of what is just the most unprecedented sort of issue I think that any of us have experienced. So my perspective, I've got a few introductory comments today, which are going to be broad-based in nature. They all span beyond just the direct sphere of clinical trial conduct in Australia, but to try and give folks on the phone, I guess, an understanding of some of the dimensions that we need to be considering as well. So, and also, just from a perspective, I've had the I guess the opportunity to sort of work through a number of quite significant crisis sort of issues where the recovery process was a very informative one and a very personally very you know, probably a key part of my own career development as well. And in the first instance, the Panadol extortion in Australia, which was about 20 years ago, Shani, and understanding how the business and the broader set of stakeholders surrounding it actually participated in that recovery. And of course, what we're seeing now, which is just absolutely unprecedented as well. So if you could pass to the first slide, please now. Or maybe the second slide, thanks, Joe. So a few introductory comments, but one of the things that I was struck, there's a lot of literature, a lot of commentary out there at the moment from all manner of parties talking about what is going on. And this is just from McKinsey, the global management consulting firm. And of course, we're in unprecedented times now. And one of a couple of points that really struck me though, the world is actually looking to our sector, the broader therapeutics sector, for the work we're doing, the contribution, for helping move society beyond where we are now. A reflection there that we don't know what necessarily is going to occur on the other side of all of this. But one of the things that did strike me was the final phrase there. So how companies act individually and collectively in the next few weeks and months will shape the way that this pandemic shakes out, and also the reputation of the industry for decades to come. If you could go to the next slide, thanks, Joe, as well. I would actually debate, however, that with McKinsey's view here, which is that this is just an industry issue, quite frankly, it's the broader therapeutics community, I'm calling it, working together. So that's both sponsor companies, it's academics, it's government regulatory authorities, it's contract organisations, and everyone who is sitting together in the broader community, therapeutics community. The way that we work together collectively in this recovery phase will be a critical determinant of how we actually come through it. And this will be a theme of my remarks, which I'll sort of come back to as I talk. Joe, could you flick to the next slide, please? So if I just have my GSK hat on at the moment, and as Shani mentioned, I these days work in the consumer healthcare sector for GSK, but you know, we're clearly a major global company, and I see across the activities that we're doing in our prescription medicines, our vaccines, and our consumer healthcare divisions. And clearly, as a company, we, like many others, are going to want to collaborate and support with research and development activities, etc. But a couple of points which, again, I think would be common themes amongst many similar companies, but it is they are important areas of focus for us. So firstly, protection of the health and well-being of our employees, and at the very most simplistic level. I mean, we've got a bunch of employees in many countries around the world and in Australia who staff and man our factories to make the medicines that we need to, that we're supplying to keep the community healthy. We need to keep these guys healthy to make the medicines. Also, similarly, to conduct the clinical research and other R&D activities that are going on as well. Secondly, the work involved in maintaining our supply chains globally is actually tremendously complex. It's also a major learning experience for us as well. I'll come back to this in subsequent slides, because I think it doesn't matter whether we're working in the clinical research sector or in other parts of the therapeutics industry, understanding the supply chain of getting our product, our investigational substances, etc., to us is going to form a key part of the recovery that we're working our way through. And then finally, just with the GSK hat on, obviously collaboration being a key part of the way that we view the world in the future. Some of you will have seen maybe mention of a joint venture with Sanofi on vaccine development, also the University of Queensland, and then two Chinese vaccine biopharma companies as well, Clover and Xiamen as well. So, and I think one of the final things, just before I flick to the next slide, I think the view is certainly GSK view, my view personally, and that from many others whom I talk to, is that there is no one single solution for a vaccine or for pathways to recovery in Australia and around the world. Joe, if you could flick to the next slide, please. So in terms of some general principles, considering how we actually go about finding our way through to recovery at the moment. So I think firstly, what I'd do is just reflect on the, I guess, good principles in managing any crisis that, be it small, be it large, whatever, that organisations might go through. And one of the key ones is separating the activities required to actually manage the crisis and the issue as against those to manage an ongoing business and prepare for recovery. And I'm sure many of you are getting drawn in many different dimensions and directions at the moment with all of these new ways of working, the new normals that we're experiencing at the moment. But being able to segregate, split out, is really a very key part of what we're having to deal with. In terms of actually, as we move to recovery, moving toward recovery, there is clearly no one single model, no one single magic recipe to help us, as a society recover, or even as individual organisations as well. It's a matter of figuring out what works for people, people within our organisations and our organisational structures. So a couple of key things that I think which are worthwhile reflecting on is what have we learnt about ways of working through this process of dealing with COVID and these new ways of working? What can we keep from these learnings, and what should we be discarding as well? Our supply and our distribution networks for all of our products, really getting them back to anywhere near normal is a critical part of how we're going about recovering. And for the sort of products we do, whether we're talking about marketed therapeutic products or investigational products, the global nature of the supply chains that pull together our products, it's really quite an interesting and informative exercise to actually understand and learn how this is all coming together. So be it the active substances which might be being made in China, or other raw materials in India, or glass for vials which is coming out of manufacturers in Europe, or whatever. how all of this is coming together into our supply chain and how those supply chains are returning to normal is a key area that I would counsel all of us to be focused on. In terms of our patients and what I'm calling here healthcare consumers, I think for all of us, we've all become extremely knowledge hungry in terms of what is going on with the COVID crisis, not only in Australia but around the world. And for us working in this sector, I think we're blessed with a degree of understanding, but we're still seeking further information as well. One of the things that we have as a sector is understanding the role that we play in communicating to our patients and to broader consumers of healthcare services, and especially understanding what the trusted sources are, but also promoting ourselves as such, as well as a potentially trusted source of information. And one of the final things here in dimensions of recovery, I did mention at the start that none of this is an activity that any of us can undertake by ourselves. And one of the things which I've been incredibly impressed with, I guess, is the degree of collaboration, the degree of innovation and new ways of working and communicating that I'm seeing between different partners and other different partners and stakeholders. And I've had the good fortune to sit on the TGA medicines shortages working group, which has seen some incredibly proactive and pragmatic collaboration and discussion to help move Australia through the crisis that we're dealing with. So collaboration and also transparency in the way that we're working as well. So Joe, if you can flick to the final slide, please. So recovering towards a new normal, in choosing a heading for this, if you can just flick back one slide, thanks, Joe. So recovering towards what we were at before is not necessarily an option, and the new normal, I'm guessing, Shani, has the potential to be a complete another webinar series in the future, but we're experiencing a unique period of time at the moment, and the impacts of that on supply chains I've mentioned, ongoing clinical research and regulatory infrastructures is unprecedented, and stakeholders coming together, and the whole issue, the whole crisis being a catalyst to optimise new ways of working and streamlining R&D and regulatory processes is an interesting and a real opportunity. And there's an FPA quote, the European Pharmaceutical Industry peak body there, who've come up with that. Also particularly interested to see the way that some regulatory authorities are actually talking about the opportunity now, and a publication from the BMJ just from a couple of weeks ago from the Centre of Regulatory Excellence in Singapore, John Lin's group, talking as a regulator about the opportunities that regulatory agility, increased regulatory agility, are actually creating through this sort of complex and rapidly evolving time as well. And then the final quote that I really like, just going back to the McKinsey paper that I referenced earlier, there's a real imperative for a change to get to a better normal, a better next normal. So a few points there just for everyone, just to throw out the general principle that this recovery process is one that requires collaboration. It is incredibly multifaceted as well, and the more we can learn from the new ways of working that we've created, the better chance we have to get to the future. So look, Shani, I hope that's served us some value, and perhaps I can throw back to you now to introduce our next speaker.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Ian. Very insightful, and just helping people understand the complexity of what we need to be doing. And I very much agree with that last quote about making the next new normal better than we've seen before is certainly a focus for us. So thank you for that. Again, questions we'll take at the end of the panelists' presentations. So the next speaker on the panel I'd like to introduce needs no introduction, but Mel Hagan Director of Queensland Clinical Trials Coordination Unit. Mel manages a complex of areas related to the delivery of clinical trials in Queensland, as well as, importantly, co-chairing the Clinical Trial Collaborative Forum, which is the group across federal and state governments incorporating industry as well, which is a very, very useful group to get together. Mel's a powerhouse of ideas and brings enormous energy to the role. Mel.
Thank you very much, Shani. I'm glad you didn't say how many years.
I'm kind like that. I'm very kind like that.
Very good like that. That's great. Look, all the things that Ian was saying really resonate with how Queensland Health is thinking about recovering through this through the pandemic. And if there's other quotes that come to mind is never let a good crisis go to waste. And our focus really is looking at what we're doing during the pandemic and trying to analyse how we can apply these changed ways of doing things to benefit the sector post-pandemic. And I want to make some comments that sort of build upon what Ian has said. But clearly, yes, there's an unprecedented heightened awareness of clinical trials, the pharmaceutical industry, vaccines and devices. I've never known a time when there are so many people who talk about clinical trials and the industry without me prompting them to. These are not people working in the space, but everybody wants to know when the vaccine trials are going to start. Everybody wants to know about the potential next therapy and repurposing existing drugs. Everybody seems to have a heightened understanding of phases and develop R&D development. So that's something that we need to think about on how do we leverage that post pandemic. The other thing is that because everybody's in it together, there's been an incredible amount of collaborative effort. And in that space as well, there's when I talk about collaborative effort, there's also been a lot of work with the collaborative trial groups. And really interesting to me from a potential regulatory perspective has been the adaptive clinical trial platforms and how they traditionally, we're thinking of collaborative non-commercial groups doing certain things and then commercial sponsors doing certain things, but we've pushed a lot of the trialists together. So potentially, is there a way to leverage this platform approach in the future, which is really bizarre because it's it's having a much more, potentially the regulators having much more influence over the trial design and approaches. We've certainly been in an environment and still are in an environment where there's disrupted monitoring, disrupted clinical trial visits and all the other trial activities. And we've certainly been bending over backwards trying to expedite approvals of any COVID-19 related clinical trials or any related research. And so so what we're trying to do is think about, okay, well, what are we doing? What's working? What can we what could we do post pandemic? And so, for example, when it comes to monitoring, people can't monitor the trials because you've got your restrictions, whether they're travel restrictions or policy in hospitals around access. So the remote monitoring concept is something that now is very much being used, and we're developing that up in quite a methodical way within Queensland Health. And we see the future where there will be remote monitoring hubs where if you're based in Sydney or Melbourne, you won't have to fly to Queensland necessarily. And that's using and leveraging the work that we've done in teletrials with our very secure and virtual Queensland Health telehealth hubs. So it's repurposing those. So it's not just for clinical trial visits, but for monitoring as well. we've certainly been helping our existing clinical trials to morph into using a teletrials model so that patient visits can continue. And we're really lucky that we've been having under pilot with industry engagement clinical trial standard operating procedures for the last few years, starting off particularly in oncology, but now everybody and all the different therapeutic areas are wanting to access that model. We've also looked at you know, one of Queensland Health's deliverables in this space is to, and this is based on an agreement we have with the Commonwealth, is to look at the clinical research coordinator workforce strategy. And when we've had disrupted from the pandemic the ability to do many trial-related activities, because the clinical workforce who are normally involved in the clinical trials, many have been redeployed so that they're more frontline or been taken away from tasks such as data entry in clinical trials. So it's been really good to access the volunteer program that ARCS has progressed, so that we can find volunteers. We can look at, and some of those volunteers we found have been ex-Queensland Health clinical trial staff that are retired, that will really want to come in and help. We've also been looking at our students and masters and university placements to see how we can assist the sites moving forward, so that the clinical people are doing more of the clinical tasks and the other project related activities, and some more administrative project tasks are done by others. We may have that workforce model as something we continue post trial. And that also helps us develop a younger cohort of people coming through, because that has been an issue for us, is the aging workforce. And if we can get some young students and volunteers and get them trained up fairly quickly with the pandemic, that will really be helpful. We've also looked at the way that we've been approving the COVID-19 related trials. So we've reorganised our ethics committees, and so we've basically now having a networked approach to HREC review. So we have NMA, but we also are trying to link up the members of our ethics committees so that reviews can happen. Basically, they're happening in a couple of days, so that they're getting together virtually and approving the trials and related research. So, you know, so we're looking at modifying our terms of reference for our ethics committees as well, so that we can again change the model going forward. And so I suppose the take-home message is the new normal needs to really be informed by the new models that we've had to implement because of the pandemic, and we really can't miss this opportunity to improve the sector. And that's all I really want to say. So I'm going to hand it back to Shani so she can go to the next speaker.
Great, thank you very much, Mel, and that was very good, concise. And look, I agree with you about the regulator involvement, and I'm pleased to see that ethics as well is it's a great idea, having the networked approach, because that has been some of the issues, getting some of those deviations through ethics as quickly as possible has been a bit of an issue, but great to see the ways that they're being addressed. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is Anita van der Meer. She is the Manager of Clinical Trials New South Wales from the Office of Health and Medical Research. Anita has only been with the department really a short time, but certainly making her mark for clinical trials in New South Wales at such a critical time. Nothing like being thrown in at the deep end, but she does that bringing 20 years. I mentioned lots of years. Damn, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. She brings many years of experience in industry prior to this to make it all happen. Thank you very much for your presentation, Anita.
Thanks, Shani, and I'm happy to own the 20 years and the grey hairs that come along with it. And thanks to ARCS for the opportunity to talk about Clinical Trials New South Wales today, both what we're doing now and what we see as happening next for clinical trials in New South Wales. Thanks, Joe. So a lot's happened in a month. At the top of this slide were the numbers that I presented at an ARCS webinar back in April, and now we're sitting at a very different position, and I think we're all very grateful to be in that position as opposed to the one that we were planning for back at the beginning of April. It's important to use these numbers to highlight that with the challenge of COVID-19, each state's and territory's experience has been very different. And so you would have seen that each of the jurisdictional responses to managing clinical trials in the COVID environment has by necessity been very individual. But I would like to reiterate Mel Hagan's words in that the context of all of our approaches across the states and territories has really been in alignment and supportive of the national COVID clinical trial guidelines, which were released by the Clinical Trial Project Reference Group, of which all of the jurisdictions are a member, in association and close collaboration with Medicines Australia, NHMRC and the TGA. I would also like to just take a minute to acknowledge that when we're talking about what we've managed to do for clinical trials in the current COVID environment and what we're planning to do for the sector in the next months and longer, this has been done within all of the jurisdictions with incredibly small teams under a very heavy workload and tight timelines, with the requirement to be really agile. And being fairly new myself to government, I can tell you that has been a big ask, but everybody across all of the states and jurisdictions has really stood up to ensure that we can continue to support clinical trials across Australia. And while we're here today talking about our individual states, we're all really aligned to ensuring that we continue to support the sector across the country. And we do that through both the CTPRG and many of the organisations such as ARCS that we work collaboratively with. Thanks, Joe. So just want to take a moment to reiterate where we are now in clinical trials with New South Wales. As you will all hopefully know, our New South Wales COVID-19 clinical trials guidance was released in March, when we were facing a very different COVID-19 situation to what we are now, and when in fact we were ramping up our hospitals to potentially be facing a significant clinical impact across the community. So thank goodness that is hopefully behind us as we now move into our next phase of less restrictions across the community. Our guidance was really established with the aims of sponsors, sites and researchers collaborating together to create a planned approach for their clinical trials based on risk mitigation. And as Ian said earlier, that was not just mitigation to our community, our patients and our healthcare workers, but also to our researchers and our sponsor staff. We've very much taken a position across New South Wales that we remain open for business wherever and however we can do that. And we've managed to see a number of our clinical trials at most of our institutions continue, albeit in some different forms. However, I do acknowledge that some of our centres have had to take a far more managed approach to their clinical trial portfolio based on their individual COVID caseload, some of our tertiary hospitals, for example, and also the workforce reprioritisation that occurred with the initial planning for the COVID response. What I would like to say now is that if you are experiencing as a sponsor, a researcher or a member of the community any difficulties in executing your clinical trial, starting up your clinical trial, or accessing a clinical trial, please do reach out to us. Joe, next slide, thanks. And next one. At Clinical Trials New South Wales, through our trial triage service, we can work with you and the other involved parties to ensure that we can move your trial through whatever roadblock may be in place as efficiently and effectively as possible. So the message we're really trying to get out to the community is New South Wales remains open for clinical trials, albeit some of those trials approach slightly differently, and where you are experiencing difficulties, please let the Clinical Trials New South Wales team know so that we can assist you. Thanks, Joe. I might change the tone now. If we can just go to the next slide. And look at what's next for clinical trials in New South Wales. And hopefully you would have all seen the recent announcement around the COVID-19 research grants from the Office for Health and Medical Research. We're essentially using COVID to direct funding into the sector. And at the moment, there's $25 million for COVID-related research currently available in 2 rounds of funding. I would point out that the $25 million in funding includes COVID-related clinical trials, both investigator-initiated clinical trials and commercially sponsored clinical trials, where there is a component of those trials in New South Wales. The trials do not need to have a lead investigator here, although that would be fantastic to see that. But as long as there is a component, i.e. a site within New South Wales, funding may be available through the COVID research grants. And I would encourage you to go to our OHMR website to read the grant guidelines and reach out to the Clinical Trials New South Wales team if you have any questions. Thank you, Joe. Some of the other areas that we're working on to support clinical trials across the state and throughout the country. I can't necessarily go into all of the detail right now today because many of those are being worked up in the background, but suffice to say that we are focusing our support on continuing to support clinical trial enabling infrastructure. We're also collaborating very closely with Medicines Australia and our commercial sponsors to ensure that we continue to bring commercially sponsored clinical trials to New South Wales, whether they're COVID related or in other therapeutic areas. And as always, we continue to provide ongoing support for the sector. So for example, we provide support for this webinar series. We've also in the past and are planning to run additional GCP training sessions for our research staff within our LHDs to ensure that our investigator researchers and sponsors can place their trials at compliant sites. And as always, we'll continue to support the various sector conferences that occur in New South Wales, just as we have in the past with the ARCS conference. And we look forward to the day when we can all meet face to face under those circumstances as well. I will let you know that there'll be further announcements around what New South Wales is doing to support the sector in the coming weeks, and the best place to find that information is on our Office for Health and Medical Research website, or please get in contact at Clinical Trials New South Wales so that we can add you to our mailing list. Thanks, Joe. We also continue to support our ongoing portfolio of work for clinical trials across the state, supporting best practice for clinical trials in New South Wales, professionalising our approach across all of our sites, developing our workforce and improving access to clinical trials for patients, for researchers and for sponsors. Thank you, Joe. And lastly, I'd just like to reiterate, if you are experiencing any difficulties with a particular trial in the state, or if you have any follow-up questions, we are here to support the sector. Please don't hesitate to get in contact with Clinical Trials New South Wales. Thank you, Shani.
Great, thank you very much, Anita. Great work done by New South Wales, and great effort on your part too for what you've achieved in such a short time. You should be very proud of yourself.
Fantastic team and support and collaboration from the sector.
Oh, what happened there? Okay. Our next speaker, Suzanne Hasthorpe, is the manager of the Coordinating Office for Clinical Trial Research in Victoria. Suzanne has enormous depth of knowledge and experience, and I won't say how many years there are, because say, like everybody else, quite a lot, that she uses to drive clinical research in Victoria. Importantly, she chairs the National Mutual Acceptance Jurisdictional Committee, as well as numerous other state-based committees and other governance roles. Suzanne will be giving Victoria's presentation today. Thank you, Suzanne. Okay, I can't hear anything. I think we've lost Suzanne. Okay, I can't see Suzanne. So how about we maybe she's got some technical difficulties. How about we move on to Angela Masterton? Angela is the Director of Clinical Management at PPD. She has overall responsibility for clinical ops in Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, reporting to the area head. She works closely with other departments within country to ensure delivery of the clinical component of PPD's clients' projects within these countries, and she's going to share with us PPD's recovery plan and what they're up to. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Shani, and thanks for the opportunity to give the CRO perspective and some of the practicalities that we're looking at as we step on that road to recovery. Much of what I'm going to say is going to reiterate what's been said already, but from our perspective, as an organisation, we're committed to being part of the COVID-19 solution. So that's locally and globally. We're working closely with our customers and our sites to make sure that we minimise the disruptions and to ensure the continued access to investigational product for patients in the ongoing studies at the moment. And as mentioned by Ian, PPD, like many other organisations, we have a heightened focus on our employees and patient safety at the moment, and also looking at our customer needs during this pandemic. We feel that we can achieve this by offering practical advice, particularly in the changing global regulatory landscape. And I only heard recently about a potential for there to be a remote FDA inspection, so we can see that even the regulators are looking at different ways to perform their tasks in this current situation. Here in Australia, we're promoting and adhering to the NHMRC guideline and TGA guidelines that have been issued earlier this year. To ensure a high level of integrity in the work that we do, we continue to monitor and assess our ongoing studies, also with a focus on looking at the new work that's coming through. We're actively deploying innovative digital and virtual solutions. We're looking at decentralised solutions where that's appropriate to overcome the challenges, and also to help ensure business continuity and to safeguard the well-being and the safety of the patients. PPD's purpose and mission is to improve health by helping our customers deliver life-changing therapies. And to that end, we're actively supporting many studies related to COVID-19, and that's treatment and vaccines globally. We're also still supporting the requests for new studies that are coming through that are non-COVID-19 related. Thanks, Jo. So I've had a look at the practical considerations to what's next, and that's returning to the on-site activities. Now, this isn't something that's going to happen, you know, as of next week. We're going to be able to go back to what we were doing before. As everybody said, you know, there's going to be a new normal, and it's going to be a stepwise process to get in there. Ian talked about the pathway to returning to the new normal, and as we plan for local recovery, some of the driving factors are all related to continuing to ensure patient safety as well as data integrity. When we're looking at future on-site activities, proper preparation will be absolutely key for an efficient and successful on-site visit. Some of the things that we need to consider as we prepare for this are listed below. So we need to review and understand any protocol deviations that have been approved and maybe implemented through the time of crisis. And this will also include any site-specific process deviations, and that could be something like the use of telehealth or home health visits, direct-to-patient IP supply, or study supplies being sent direct to patients. Now, these are things that we've considered in the past but never had to implement, but we've seen this being put into practice throughout the last few months. All of these deviations from approved practices have to be appropriately documented and reported. And that's something as a CRO that we'll be working with the sites to make sure is in place and appropriately managed as we go forward. Review of all expected patient visits since the last on-site visit. We need to review this to make sure that we have a clear and concise picture of the status of each subject. Again, to assess any deviations from the protocol, so whether they've missed visits or there's been a change in the visit method, whether that's been a telehealth visit or no, or something else. We need to understand the backlog. So that can be backlog in electronic and EDC review, query resolution related to that, source data verification, IP accountability, as well as any backlog of tasks for the sites, so that we can offer support to the sites as we start to have more of a demand on their time. Obviously, throughout the crisis, there'll be ongoing adverse events and serious adverse events that will have occurred, and it's important for us to review these either on site or when we get on site to ensure patient safety is continued to be considered. There are many other factors that will need to be considered as we prepare and as we get back on site, but this will altogether will help us to understand the time that we may need when we're trying to get back to on-site activities. But there are many other barriers that need to be taken into consideration. The availability of the site staff. Even if sites are open to monitoring, as I said, there'll be a backlog of activities that the site have to take into consideration. And also, there'll be demands on the site staff time, whether that's for on-site activities or for continued remote activities. So we have to be considerate of everyone's needs. And as part of that, we will have to continue with remote visits and remote SDV where that's appropriate. As I said earlier, we won't be returning to on-site visits immediately. There'll be a staggered approach, taking into consideration everybody's time and availability. Next slide, Jo. So everybody's talked about the new normal. we don't know what that new normal is going to be. We've got an idea, but nobody's got a crystal ball. So I thought it would be good to just quote Benjamin Franklin. So out of adversity comes opportunity. And we can see that everybody's looking at how we're going to conduct clinical trials within Australia and globally as we move out of this crisis. There may be new technologies and different ways of working that's going to come out of this. And I just couldn't resist this quote when I saw the picture. And as it says, necessity is also the mother of invention. And going forward into the next webinars, ARCS will continue to explore just what is the new normal in this COVID series of webinars.
Fantastic, thanks, Ange. That's terrific. I've been trying to think of a really good joke to say to the bagpiper blowing up or releasing the air out of that tyre, but anyway, it'll come to me afterwards. So look, thank you for that. I think it's been really useful to get the CRO perspective. We've now got Suzanne Haslop back online. Was a bit of a technical hitch there, so we will go back to Suzanne now to be our final speaker. Suzanne, I did introduce you before, and I said you'd got a great amount of depth of knowledge and experience to add to this conversation. So thank you, Suzanne. So I'm not hearing Suzanne right at the moment.
No, no one is. I don't think Shani is.
Okay, all right. Look, if we can't otherwise get Suzanne up and running, I might open it up to questions because I know we're getting short of time as well if we do get Suzanne on. Look, before we get on to the questions, again, I'd like to thank all of our speakers that we've had on today. I think it's been very, very insightful, very useful, and great to hear how people are thinking through some of these issues. I'd like to thank our sponsors who've helped us to be able to deliver this. And again, if you're on the call and you haven't been a member of ARCS before, now's the time to join up. Membership is open for our next financial year. So please come and join us, be part of the conversation and part of the advocacy on behalf of people who work at the coalface or at the COVID face or whatever. So I think we're not hearing Suzanne still. So I'll hand it over to Sue Mason, who's going to triage questions for us. And if we do get Suzanne on, then we can jump back to her. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Shani. This is a question for Melissa. What is the risk that in the rush to approve everything as fast as possible, that we will end up with so many studies looking for the same population, none of them recruit and meet their objectives, i.e. we get more research waste? Has this risk been considered?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the things that's been interesting about the collaborative group trials and how potentially they can be used to avoid that. So one that comes to mind is REMAP-CAP, and that's an ICU study that it was basically designed for after swine flu came, and they couldn't get trials up and fast enough to in time to actually begin before the swine flu finished. So to avoid that, the intensive care intensivists created this adaptive platform design that you could add new treatment arms to as they came on board. It was for community-acquired pneumonia. And what's been really interesting is that as potential repurposing of existing treatments have been brought forward, it's become quite obvious that you could use this platform to assess the one trial to assess a multitude of potential therapies, and these are global studies, so they're looking at 1,500 to 2,000 patients per treatment arm or domain, and that's how they call it. And so, and yet there's a multitude of registries that have been set up. So not clinical trials, that each of the, whether it's a rheumatoid arthritis registry, whether it's a surgical registry. So those have been reviewed, and we have a statewide view of what's coming through. So we do know if there's a potential duplication, and we can have a chat to the sponsor about maybe thinking about collaborating with some of the other partners. And so yes, so that's the short answer is yes, has been considered.
Thanks, Melissa. There's another question for you as well. Are monitors allowed to view identifiable participant data remotely within a secure, controlled electronic medical record system? And is explicit participant consent required for remote viewing of their data?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So so we're working up our model with legal input, HR input, and as well as the privacy teams. And within Queensland Health, we do have a secure virtual room, basically, which is this telehealth portal that's used for clinical visit. You know, basically, you have a clinical assessment with your doctor, and you're the patient downloading an app. And so we're looking at repurposing that for the to do virtual remote monitoring via that platform. Now, clearly, patients give consent for monitors and CRAs and others to look at identifiable information in the patient consent form. We are just trying to get confirmation if we need to amend those PICFs to include the use of a different platform to review that, and we're still waiting for that advice. But once we get it, we'll be either not amending the PICFs to introduce that model, or doing or we will be amending this consent forms dependent on that legal advice.
Mel, this is Anita from New South Wales. If I may add there as well, and please correct me if I misunderstand. At the current time, I believe the CTPRG advice generally is that additional consent, i.e. update to PICFs, is not required for remote access, keeping in mind that jurisdictions may need to have a local approach.
Yes, that's definitely correct, Anita. And our local approach is just getting that the final legal review.
Yeah, understood. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so have we got further questions, Sue?
We do, but I just noticed that we've got 1 minute left. So do you want to take those offline, Shani?
Look, okay, we will take those offline then, Sue. Thank you so much. And look, again, thank you so much to MTP Connect and New South Wales Health for sponsoring this, and thank you also to our speakers. It's been really great to hear such a diverse range of views of people, and yet see that everybody is working so well together. It's very encouraging. All right, we'll see you next week. We have our session number 8, and that's again going back to HREC and governance, which for everybody seemed to be quite a number of I guess bottlenecks happening there, and hearing from speakers there will be fantastic. So again, thank you so much for everybody's time, and we'll see you next week. Okay, bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.